So now we move on to our final panel of the day, and it's going to be one that is probably going to divide opinions amongst our audience. And that's, is there a need for nuclear power in our future energy mix? We are joined by Professor Gregg Butler, Jonty Haynes, and Kirsty Gogan. So I will give them all an opportunity to introduce themselves for about a minute, and then we'll go into the crux of the question regarding this panel. One thing I ask our panelists is if and when you want to answer a question, if you could just lift your hands up, then we know who to go to and we don't all speak over each other. So I will start with Gregg. Welcome, Gregg.
Right. I've been in nuclear forever. Had a UK grant when I went to university, did a PhD with an equipment grant on uranium metal alloys, then went to Springfields, did R&D for 6 years on light water reactor fuel routes with a few patents involved, including some on MOX. Managed uranium metal plants, 50 ton of uranium bars made a week. What a place. Then commercial planning on cable and centrifuge plants, then managed the actual plants, and then back to Springfields, presented with 4,200 people and 2,500 long-term justified jobs. That was a wonderful job. Fortunately, me and the conveners still buy each other pints every now and again, so it wasn't all bad. Then 1990 was posted to Sellafield as back-end director. Same mission, too many people, not enough money. And then I became deputy chief executive of BNFL. The chief executive was kicked upstairs. I applied for his job, came second, and had to leave. Been doing consultancy and part-time at Manchester. Made Professor of Science in Sustainable Development. But now mainly concerned with how nuclear fits in the world, what it can do, what it can't. Long-time member of Committee on Radioactive Waste Management, now a member of Nuclear of NIRAB, which Kirsty is also a member of, and was memorably for me a main author on the BNFL National Stakeholder Dialogue, which conditioned my attitude to stakeholder relations completely. That's me.
You really have a wealth of experience, but far more than I have. But now we're going to hear from Jonty, where you can introduce yourself. Perfect.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, slightly intimidated by the wealth of experience. It's detailed. Yes, my name is Jonty Haynes. I'm a senior analyst at Regen. Regen are a centre of energy expertise with a sort of a mission-led approach to hopefully transform the world's energy systems to a lower carbon future. For the past few years, I've been specifically working with predominantly with electricity and gas networks, sort of preparing for what the ramifications of a more decarbonised and rapidly decarbonising system might actually mean. So obviously nuclear could play a huge role depending on what kind of scenarios and futures you're looking at, and have massive implications for the energy system. Most recently, I've been working directly with National Grid, ESO, trying to sort of visualise and contextualise a net zero power system by 2035. And then more broadly thinking about not just the net zero power system, but whole system thinking around the 2050 net zero target.
Thank you, Jonty. And finally, Kirsty, last but not least.
Yeah, thanks. So I studied politics and economics and have spent my whole career working in sort of environmental issues. After I finished my first degree, I went to basically become an environmental activist. I sort of grew up in the Reclaim the Streets era, sort of pre-Extinction Rebellion, but lived in Romania building straw bale houses on Romanian orphan children's camps and planting forests and traveling everywhere by train and traveling overland to India and all doing sort of grassroots environmental work. And then really got a bit frustrated about, the difference that we were making. So I went into government and worked in John Prescott's press office, working on sustainability issues, and then into Number 10, where I launched the Energy White Paper, where Tony Blair put nuclear back on the table, actually, which, at the time I was sort of by default as an environmentalist anti-nuclear. But then a turning point came for me when I was given Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air by Professor Sir David Mackay, which I'm sure many of your audience will be very familiar with, and which he number crunches through the realities of trying to achieve at that time 80% carbon emissions reductions using existing technologies, and the major constraints that we would face in terms of the scale of energy production that would be needed, including the land use implications. And he also covered nuclear, and that was the sort of beginning of my journey looking again at nuclear energy. And that's what I've been doing ever since. And now here I am. I went into, I post-Fukushima reviewed the national response to Fukushima. And as part of that work, I needed to read all of the sort of World Health Organization and United Nations reports about the public health impacts of the last big disaster at Chernobyl, and actually found, to my surprise, that the major public health impact was not really radiation at all, but was actually fear. And so I started my first NGO, Energy for Humanity, which was really sort of advocating for the environmental humanitarian benefits of nuclear energy. And now TerraPraxis is the sort of next evolution of that, which is designing strategies to make nuclear energy actually useful. So just developing, better delivery and deployment models that enable the kinds of costs and speed and scale that would be needed for nuclear energy to play a meaningful and useful contribution towards solving climate.
Thank you. See, this is going to be an interesting panel because you guys all have a wealth of knowledge, but it is a subject that is always full of opinion as well as facts. And I really want to get to the crux of the question, which is, with much opposition from environmental groups, and even the Scottish government is committing to more nuclear power, which was in the recent energy security strategy really the right strategy. Who wants to take that first? Gregg.
It depends whether you want to decarbonise or not, basically, because it's going to be very difficult to decarbonise 100% by 2050. And in my estimation, it'll be impossible if you cut out the one firm deliverable, virtually zero carbon power source that you've got. So I think that's the first point. If you want to go for net zero, you need nuclear, and we can discuss at whatever length is necessary what nuclear can do, because it isn't just electricity.
Kirsty, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I would take I would put it slightly differently. I would say that we should consider what the risk is of failing to decarbonize and how willing we are to take that risk. And if there are additional tools that we could bring into de-risking that clean energy transition within the timescales. So we have this kind of scale and timescale challenge. We have to not only decarbonize the electricity sector, but the entire economy. And that means, industry and transport and heat, which is about, that's 3/4 of our current energy use. And, we have to do that within 28 years, really, completely get to zero. Or, right now we're not doing it. We're not decarbonizing. We're doing quite well in the electricity sector, but we have made no progress in the other sectors. And, if we care about the risk of failing, then why wouldn't we add additional technologies to de-risk that?
The next, Jonty, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think we're all looking to jump in on this one. I think there's an interesting point to be made around. There's a 2050 goal of we need to be as close to zero carbon as possible by 2050. But I think there's also a very strong imperative to decarbonise as radically and quickly as possible over the next decade or so as well. I think nuclear has, I would agree that there are some very strong benefits for nuclear in terms of designing a future completely zero carbon energy system. I think it needs to go hand in hand with really quickly deployable methods of decarbonisation, whether that be energy efficiency, whether that be massive rollout of renewables. So there's the interesting part of looking at it from both those perspectives. I think probably makes your question even harder in terms of the role for nuclear in both of those strategies.
Yeah. Can I just add something to that? Because, do you guys know what the historically the fastest decarbonisation of the electricity grid has been per capita? Multiple times. It's the addition of nuclear energy. Even the really slow, expensive historic, Olkiluoto, for example, just came online in Finland, and it took 16 years to build. It's like horribly over schedule, a bad project, and yet that still is a lot faster in terms of the overall addition of clean electricity per capita to the electricity grid than even all of the wind and solar additions within that same 15-year period in Germany, for example. So, it's true that you can sort of build these wind and solar projects quickly, but they're tiny compared to the kind of output that you get from nuclear energy. And the other thing that I would say, and that's not to say we should be competing them, we should be doing both things. But, the other thing to say is that, you might say, well, it's going to take until, the late 2020s to commercialize and demonstrate these small modular reactors. But if we act now to design the enabling facilitative actions that will be required to deploy those technologies at a large scale when they are demonstrated and commercialized in 2027, 28, then we could actually be deploying very, very large amounts of clean energy, when we really need it, which is going to be, I agree with you, this is a critical decade that we really need it. And, so it's a kind of like, well, yes, there's sort of what can we do now, but there's also what kind of scale can we achieve, within these timescales in terms of large deployment for heat and hydrogen as well as power.
I get your point there regarding within a 15-year period, but we had a session earlier where it was speaking about how 15 years ago wind power especially wasn't particularly a big sector, but it has grown time and time again. And obviously by 2030, we're looking at doubling our offshore wind capacity. So could it be that this wind and solar technology is suddenly going to overtake the speed capacity that nuclear has added? So yes, right now, because it's a more established technology, it's adding more generation to the grid much faster, but in the future, it could be outpaced by renewables as the supply chain for renewables grows. Gregg.
I mean, I think the key thing is that here that we're talking about the whole system.
Yeah,
there is a limit to how much renewables you can use, unless you put in ways of evening out the generation. Nothing you're going to do is going to make onshore or offshore wind deliverable on a predictable basis. So you've got to look at whole systems. You've got to look at how you're going to even out the bumps. And I think that's where a lot of the interesting thing is. I know that Kirsty is very interested in thermal storage. So am I. But basically, there's a huge amount of work's got to be put in to the overall system. And I think and certainly as far as nuclear is concerned, I think it's a question of, okay, how quickly can you do what? And I mean, we're talking about heat and electricity, not just electricity. So we're looking about high temperature nuclear heat to be able to generate hydrogen. from thence to generate ammonia, etc., etc., etc. And really, we know there's a critical path that leads to an early demonstration of HTGR by early 30s. We also know that if we fail that test by 3 or 4 years, it's going to be very serious. So, there are certain things that you've got to say, okay, is this on the critical path of the whole thing? If answer yes, get your head down and bloody do it. Meanwhile, in the periphery, find out what that's got to fit into when you get there.
I know, Kirsty, you had something to say regarding.
Yeah, I don't know if Jonty wants to come in too.
John,
you go first, Kirsty.
Okay. So, and then you can respond, because I'm curious. Actually, I kind of have a question, actually, and you may know the answer to this, which is, that we have the in energy systems modeling, we put technologies into the model, and usually the kind of key metric is cost. And if it's low cost, then we build a lot of it, right? That's the kind of broad assumption. But actually, we know that in practice, just because it's cheap, it doesn't mean you can build it. And we're seeing this mega trend in many places that have been really successful in deploying a lot of renewables projects. But those projects are using the best available sites in terms of, straightforward land ownership questions, access to transmission, good, wind or solar resources, and so on. And as those sites get used up, and offshore wind is a good example, you get pushed further out. You have to then invest more in transmission. You end up with sort of interesting shadowing issues that impact on capacity factors that reduce the profitability of projects. So there's many factors that would actually indicate that there will be a slowing down of deployment rates unless we really plan for that and take that seriously and design for that, which this is my question. Are we doing that? Are we really interrogating the feasibility of the siting challenges for these technologies? And I'll give you one example in Iowa, where the National Renewable Energy Lab suggests that we have 590 gigawatts of technical potential in Iowa. It's a very windy state. And we did an assessment over a decade where 19 gigawatts were built. And at the end of that 10-year period, 2/3 of the counties in the state had imposed restrictions on moratoria on any more wind development in that state. 19 gigawatts of the 590 gigawatts of technical potential. So, this is a sort of real material constraint that we need to be planning for. We need to be really anticipating and taking into account, and anticipating the public opposition that might come, and anticipating the siting challenges, because project developers need to know that they have low risk projects that are going to be profitable if they're going to build them. So I'm a little concerned that we are lacking the sort of interrogation of feasibility here, and it's kind of given how much is at stake. So who's doing that work? That's my question in the renewables sector, because I would feel a lot happier to know that was being done. And then, we shouldn't be double counting it for hydrogen production, by the way, either, if we're planning to decarbonize the grid with all that space.
Jonty, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, I don't have a direct answer to that, but I think it is a really good point that I think I might have been reading something you've actually produced, Kirsty, around how we assumed a hockey stick curve in the past, and actually it's more of an S curve when you actually look at.
Oh yeah, that does sound like one of ours.
That does sound familiar again.
And it's not to rain on the parade. It's just guys, we want to succeed here. We have to succeed. So yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. I guess in terms of renewables, it's always that tricky question for me of they have huge potential to keep reducing in cost, and therefore you kind of have the better sites get used up, but the lower cost technologies come online. But that is a gamble, and sort of the likes of going further and further offshore into floating offshore wind and such is hugely exciting and could be hugely beneficial, and that's great if that does come to fruition. I absolutely get your point that there are almost certainly bumps in the road in terms of all these kind of low carbon technology deployment. I guess my question would be whether, in terms of that public sort of social license to operate and using up the most ideal sites first. And even when you're looking at things like self-cannibalization of generation, when you can argue it for solar and nuclear in terms of all generating too much at the same time when we need it less. Is that also a question for nuclear as much as it is for renewables, or is there a different sort of aspect coming on there?
I certainly think the question of siting for nuclear is very, very relevant indeed, in that the instinct is to go back to 2008 or whatever it was, to EN6, and this is how we did it, and this is how we look for sites, and we've got 8 whole sites that we had then. But if you're looking for, say, nuclear high-temperature gas reactors for hydrogen production, you might be looking for a lot more sites than that, and you might be looking for them relatively quickly. And also, you probably will be looking for quite a few of them in areas that haven't had nuclear before. So you're talking about very interesting societal challenges. And I think it really needs a step back to look at how you're going to start answering those challenges. And I don't think you start with what we did last time. You might start with questioning what we did last time, but I mean, I firmly believe that there is going to be an element of localish societal buy-in to future nuclear sites, and if there isn't, it'll grind to halt after 8 sites or whatever it is. So I think there's a real large amount of work to be done on, okay, how are we, what are the number of sites going to be needed? And there's no clear view of that at the moment. When are we going to get that? And what are we going to do about it when we do? And certainly the current situation where things that were built in the 60s, Magnoxes, are still sitting there, and will, according to the policies, will remain there for a long time. But if you look at it from the point of view of the local society, they probably think it's going to be there forever, and so do I. So it'll be very difficult to go into. We want 50 or 60 new sites on the back of, and by the way, they're going to have dead reactors on them for the next 1,000 years. So I think there's an awful lot of thinking on a societal basis needs to be done.
Should I have a go as well here?
Yeah, I just pushed it.
We're an unruly panel here.
No, it's
Jordan.
It's absolutely fine. Jump in on each other's points. It's definitely welcome.
Well, so Gregg, you may remember that the ETI, the Energy Technologies Institute, commissioned a power plant siting study by Atkins, and
yes.
That was to answer this question actually about the sites that might be available and appropriate for new gigawatt scale nuclear plus SMRs plus advanced reactors. And I think what they found from memory, I've just stuck the link actually to the study here into the chat if anyone's interested. But I think they found there was existing brownfield former nuclear sites that could accommodate 75 gigawatts of nuclear altogether. And that would include decommissioned sites and so on. And we know that sites that have had nuclear or currently have operating nuclear tend to have very supportive communities around them, because those communities know that those plants make good neighbors and great employers, and they're often located in rural areas. And so the employment opportunities there are very, very welcomed. And we're seeing actually in the US, we're seeing several states that have historically had moratoria on any nuclear new build, legislating to overturn the nuclear moratoria, because these are coal states and they're really interested in the prospect of repowering their coal plants that are currently, slated to shut down with advanced reactors. And we the first project is underway in Wyoming, the TerraPower, which is Bill Gates's advanced reactor company, in concert with GE to develop a new advanced reactor co-located with a former coal plant site. And the 4 communities were competing to host that site. Only one got it, but the other 3 really want one as well. And that plant is really interesting because they're integrating thermal energy storage, which, as Gregg said, yes, I am very interested in thermal energy storage. And it's partly because it enables your nuclear plant to run at its full capacity 90% of the time. And I either be charging the battery, essentially, or generating directly to the grid. And that's very complementary to grids with high penetrations of renewables, makes a very profitable plant, is very flexible, so you sort of get all these benefits. So in answer, I guess, to your point as well, Jonty, having nuclear contribute to future electricity grids with this really flexible, dispatchable, zero carbon option delinks the need for gas. And I noticed in your recent study with which featured only a very sort of traditional baseload role for nuclear energy, you could have a nuclear contribution into that future electricity grid that negates the need for long-term energy storage, short-term energy storage that would otherwise be expensive if you were trying to use batteries or something, as well as the really big dependence on interconnectors. So really, this is, if it's about as much about energy security and good cost outcomes for consumers, then we really should be seeking the sort of the lowest cost, most affordable way of achieving the reliable, clean energy system, and nuclear technology could contribute to that.
Do you want to respond?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think I agree with a lot of it. In reference to the study we did with National Grid, this was a sort of a day in the life of a challenging winter day of a net zero power system in 2035. So we were looking at sort of challenging as in there's very low wind, there's very low solar. There's quite a lot of electricity demand, especially not just for conventional demand, but also electric vehicles and electric heating and such. And I completely agree. When we pick one future, I've always said there's a lot of way. There's no way one future that you pick and sort of in the study is going to be right. There's lots of ways to be wrong. So we kind of hedged our bets a bit around how much nuclear was on the system, how much interconnection, how much storage, how much wind and solar could you actually have on a low day. And I completely agree that on a winter day, a lot more nuclear would have made that whole modelling study and narrative so much more easy because we've got lots of demand the whole time. I'm not involved, I'm tangentially involved in our next study, which is a sister study on what would it look like on a summer day where you've got lots of renewables and lots of nuclear, and in some ways they go hand in hand in being, zero short run marginal cost generation. So my question there is that nuclear really has to then be flexible, or we end up having, it's a good problem to have, having too much very cheap low carbon generation, but that is still potentially something that we would have to think about dealing with. And I guess overall it comes down to, regardless of how much renewables there is and how much nuclear there is, both of them would do far, far better and work much more efficiently in a system that is really, really flexible across the entire chain. Whether that's flexible, smart EV charging, whether that's more flexible with sort of heat through energy efficiency and thermal storage, or whether that's through more flexibility on the supply side with that really, I was looking into that sort of thermal storage to decouple the nuclear heat generation with the nuclear generation, electricity generation. That looks incredibly exciting, as would, co-locating electrolyzers or co-locating batteries with renewables or nuclear. So I think there's a theme there that actually a lot of those challenges or ways we can make the energy system more efficient and more effective are exactly almost identical for renewables and nuclear. And going forward with them together would make a lot of sense in that case.
Yeah, it's really important that we don't overbuild the system, obviously, and we sort of are very efficient in our planning. And I think we, a couple of just brief responses there. So it would be really great to see this modeled, and Aurora Energy Research did actually model these kinds of flexible nuclear applications, including cogeneration of hydrogen, heat and power. with the nuclear technology producing hydrogen the majority of the time, but with the option to generate electricity on the grid during that kind of seasonal lull that you're describing, and therefore no longer needing long-term energy storage, which resulted in a much lower cost overall system. But you do need to have, for the hydrogen production to make sense, you really need a high capacity factor production of hydrogen. There's, that's the key cost driver in the hydrogen production cost. So to get below $2 a kilogram, you really got to be kind of like up at 80% of the use of the electrolyzers, because that's a high capital cost. And the other thing I would say, in your studies, I just pointed to the siting study for nuclear, which was a very, very, a very large study carried out by Atkins, looking at the feasibility of siting new nuclear technologies in the UK, and concluded this quite conservative, result that these, identified sites would be appropriate and feasible. I would love to see that being done for renewables as well, because, frankly, it's unethical, irresponsible to be sort of putting any large amounts, 30 gigawatts or, any sort of tens of gigawatts of any kind of technology without doing some kind of feasibility analysis for the siting of those technologies. There's too much at stake to, get in, several years down the track and realize that we can't do it.
The one thing I would note is we've spoken a lot about, nuclear energy as like a base load provider, but I know we've touched a little bit on using it for hydrogen production, but that's because nuclear energy, essentially a nuclear power plant isn't just generating electricity, it also generates heat, and that could be used for a lot of other things. I know, Gregg, you've got a study or a report on how it could be potentially used for heat networks or in the use of producing hydrogen. Do you want to talk more about that?
Well, I think we're in a bit of a throwback phase in that so many otherwise influential bodies like the Climate Change Committee, et cetera, have only looked at nuclear as an electricity supplier. And they seem to have ignored the fact that for the last 4 years or so, there's been quite a big evolution of UK nuclear strategy from basically one wave, which is basically you make gigawatt-sized light water reactors, to two waves where you make gigawatt-sized light water reactors and you make small modular reactors on the basis that you can probably build them quicker and cheaper. So that might be the way to go. And Rolls-Royce are leading a big project on that, and let's hope that works. And then, of course, you've got Wave 3, which was initiated, I think more or less initiated by NIRAB about 3 years ago, which said high temperature nuclear heat can be used for hydrogen, can be used via hydrogen for all sorts of other things. And we ought to look at nuclear, if you like, Wave 3, as being for these purposes. And I think that is going it still hasn't dawned on the Climate Change Committee, but you can't have everything. But now we are looking at, okay, what the Bays have got a competition out for relatively small amounts of money, but still amounts of money, looking at what sort of HTGR systems could be put in, by when, what sort of costs. There's a separate competition on where we'd get the fuel from, and I think that really just widens the whole debate. And certainly for me, I mean, I'm a poor object in that I feel the cold, and the thought of having a house heated by an Air Force heat pump, air source heat pump, terrifies me, because you need radiators half the size of the house, and it can't be very hot. And I'd be spending most of my time crouched over an electric fire. Whereas, give me a new boiler, which is hydrogen effective, and I'll do that very well. Thank you very much. So I have to declare that deep down, there's a thought of, if you survive this, Gregg, do you want to survive being cold? No, I don't.
And that's the other thing. Heat pumps are expensive for consumers. Yeah. So consumers are going to find they have to shell out. Like, we talk a lot about cost of nuclear power plants, but when consumers are then suddenly being told you have to pay for this really expensive heat pump and the electricity that comes to supply it, there is an argument there that there are alternative means such as hydrogen boilers. Did anyone else want to chime in on the benefits that nuclear have outside of just being a baseload generator?
I'd love to jump in on heat pumps, but I feel like I would derail the conversation.
Well, I'm curious what you would say about that, actually, because I mean, I just want to put this back into the kind of, let's talk about the risk of failing to decarbonize. Yeah. Okay, that this is, what this whole effort is really about, and within that, includes some requirements around costs and public acceptability and so on. And we have a theory of change, actually, which you may have, sorry if you've heard me say this before, but we like to use the analogy of the Impossible Burger, which is the, because actually David Mackay said to me when I said to him, I'm starting to work on nuclear, he said, if you think that's controversial, try meat. And yeah, and, of course, no politician will tell people to eat less meat, right? Because it's and then the Impossible Burger comes along, which is a plant-based meat substitute. Looks like a burger, tastes like a burger. You can buy it in existing, Burger King chains or whatever, and it doesn't require any behavior change. It costs the same. And so actually we probably need lots of our climate solutions to be like Impossible Burgers, which means drop-in substitutes that are competitive with or comparable in cost and performance to the fossil fuels that we use today. And yes, the application of heat, and I'm getting to the kind of question here, the application of heat for the production, very efficient, very large scale production of hydrogen-based synthetic fuels. And I would be careful to say that we don't really see a big role for hydrogen as an end-use fuel, because it was way too much investment in new associated storage, transport, and distribution infrastructure, as well as a whole ton of new investment in end-use infrastructure. And frankly, all of that investment in new infrastructure represents cost and risk, because you have to get that investment, that capital investment, and sequence it in a way that makes the public confident. Even actually installing the kind of charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, which are incredibly attractive and wonderful, is going to be really challenging. And then everybody has to buy a new car, and so even that thing that we think it should be really quite straightforward and simple, if you've ever been in an electric car and you know how nice they are, is going to be really challenging. And then you scale that out to the full energy transition, and you realize pretty quickly that we're going to need synthetic fuels that are Impossible Burgers, essentially, that you can use an existing transport, storage, distribution, end-use infrastructure. And hydrogen is the critical ingredient in the ammonia or the synthetic hydrocarbons that we need. And frankly, high capacity factor, high temperature heat, very small environmental footprint, and potentially very low costs. Nuclear energy seems like a pretty good option to deliver that, hydrogen at the scale. 100 million barrels of oil per day, people that we use, very, very low, right? We haven't talked about scale. I mean, I know we're focused on the UK, but yeah, the application of heat is going to be very useful.
I must say, looking at the trials that are planned and going ahead on hydrogen distribution by pipeline, and the fact that the high capacity pipelines will already take the stuff, and the fact that there aren't many of us left now that can actually remember where town gas was 50% hydrogen anyway. So I mean, I don't see I don't see
it might be a bridge, but it's not going to get us all the way to zero. That's the only problem. We'd have to upgrade and change.
Nothing on its own will get us all the way to zero. We're going to have to use everything.
Yeah.
And I think it will be interesting to see how the uses of hydrogen turns out, because I agree with you. There's an awful lot of money to be put in somewhere, and it's got to come from somewhere. But they can have my bit as long as I don't have to have an air source heat pump.
And it would be nice to electrify everything, but again, can we really do that in the timescales?
And the answer is no, I'm sure, on the timescale.
The one thing I will say is we've been talking a lot about cost, and that has been a major downside to nuclear energy versus renewables. I think in a recent government report, they estimate by 2050, offshore wind will cost around £57 per megawatt hour. Onshore wind, £46, and large scale solar is also £46. But nuclear power is £102 per megawatt hour. How do we justify that cost?
Well, I mean, I'm sure Kirsty and Gregg will come in on those costs themselves. I don't think you could justify £102 per megawatt hour. But my understanding is that future nuclear wouldn't be looking at that kind of, like, Hinkley C is somewhat first of its kind in sort of the modern nuclear fleet. And, Sizewell, for example, was built with a lot of the same workforce and a lot of the learnings and a lot of the similar design as Hinkley, then, if that's the same price or more expensive, then something's gone terribly wrong. So I guess the question is how, and I don't know the answer to this, I'm hoping someone does, how much lower can nuclear get if we're looking at not just, learning from previous designs and current designs, but also things like small modular reactors, because 100 odd pounds, it isn't justifiable for consumers, and that wouldn't be accepted.
I mean, the problem with nuclear is the rate of financing. I mean, that £102 is definitely not using a regulated asset base. It's using the current system, and in many ways, I mean, it is a test. I mean, if Rolls can't make cheap SMRs that do cheaper than that, they won't get built. If we can't do HCGRs that produce hydrogen at a reasonable price, it won't happen. So a lot of this, but so much of nuclear at the moment is because A, we've been building them one at a time, and B, we've been using a very high rate of return on them. Mm-hmm. So yes, you get 100 and something, but when you've got it, by God, it's good to have, because the marginal cost of production is, in comparison, sweet sod all. So once you've got the animal, it can generate, and also, I mean, the sort of lives we're talking about. I mean, they're probably talking about LWRs having a life around 80 years. Well, at that point, you've paid for it a long time ago.
Kirsty,
I totally agree with you, Jonty. It's completely unjustifiable, and it's the biggest issue, but however, I would say that I'm not going to predict that nuclear is going to achieve any particular cost outcome, because it's not really about predictions. It's about making good choices, let's say. It's very, we've done it. I mean, we could have a whole webinar about this, but we've done a ton of work looking at what drives the cost outcomes of gigawatt scale conventional nuclear projects. And we know that programmatic approaches, where you sort of invest in establishing skills and capability in the supply chain and workforce and leadership team and regulator and everything, then does, if you then sort of repeatedly build the same design, once you've licensed it and built it once, then you can get down to very low costs. And the majority of plants around the world today are being delivered for less than $4,000 a kilowatt. For our repowering coal project, we have a target cost of $2,000 a kilowatt. And we're achieving that through a whole bunch of design innovations that are really sort of informed by, firstly, moving away from a traditional construction-based approach, where you have a lot of site-by-site redesign and an EPC, and it's all, it's just basically handmade artisan nuclear plants is what we're building at the moment. And they're really expensive. It's like, away from that to a product-based approach, where you have a very standardized manufactured product that's designed for manufacture and assembly, and we think that that's really achievable, and we think that if we can't achieve that, then the role for nuclear energy is going to be very limited. So, but we need good incentives. We need everybody to kind of recognize that this could be really useful if we can do it well and get behind it and do it.
The other issue isn't just cost, though. It's the other argument a lot of, especially environmentalists, will make is while it is clean at the point of generation, there is obviously nuclear waste to deal with. And there's currently arguments in Sweden as to whether or not their solution is actually good long term. So obviously we need to also take that into account from a strategy point of view.
And we do for all technologies.
But how do you deal with the inherent issue of nuclear waste? We
do deal with it. We deal with it. It's never harmed anybody or the environment. It's incredibly tiny and it's incredibly well contained. It's presenting no, public health or environmental risk. And, we need long-term storage solution. But frankly, I'm worried about the waste that is contributing to public health impacts today. 7 million premature deaths per year from air pollution. Yeah. There's a lot more radiation coming out of a coal plant than there is from any nuclear plant, I can tell you that. And, all technologies have to take responsibility for their waste streams. And, why are we singling out spent fuel, which we'll probably recycle in future reactors anyway? I'm sorry if I sound a little impatient with this.
That's okay.
God, our
yeah, I know. I
so
completely
bad
get it.
at making assessments of risk.
Yeah.
We're just like.
I mean, certainly, if you've been inundated in the regulation of nuclear in general and nuclear waste, and I was the person that interacted with the regulators in BNFL for about 6 years. Now, fortunately, I had a very sensible set of regulators with me. But certainly, I mean, you can set up things where you cost yourself an absolute fortune for no particular benefit. So it really does require, it doesn't cost a fortune in terms of pounds per megawatt hour to actually take care of the waste, make sure it doesn't hurt anybody, put in the actions which will be required for a long term. I mean, we were in a different position 5 years ago, where people like the NDA and their and NIREX's successors, etc., were trying to bulldoze waste disposal onto local communities. And that really didn't work. It worked in West Cumbria, but unfortunately, the thing needed a vote of Cumbria in general, and Cumbria in general, the Luffy Lake District, said, no, go and get stuffed. Now, and that was the end of it, until some more enlightened people said, well, why don't we look for volunteers? And the amount of money that the volunteers are getting is considerable, but is not considerable compared to the magnitude of the potential problem that they're solving. And we've got 4 local groups looking at what the implications are of having the UK's nuclear waste disposed of in their area. And if you put it like that, what's the downside? What's the upside? And you've asked the question, and how could it be kept safe? And you've got a really exhaustive answer. And you've got a lot of very dedicated scientists who are clearly good at their job and are making sure they don't kill lots of people. I think all of a sudden it looks more manageable. And that is actually why I'm really interested in siting of new reactors, because I think siting of new reactors is going to have to move at least somewhat in that direction. That people actually
agree to it.
Decide.
Talk to the people who are like already exposed to very severe climate impacts, the recent heat wave in India and Pakistan, right? And then, have a think about how indulgent this whole discussion is around, around waste.
Yeah. I think that's
the one
extraordinarily good point, Kirsty, because at the moment there's lots on the other side of the equation that we can point to that's happening now. Sorry.
I don't want to dwell. Sorry, I don't want to dwell too much on waste because it's something that I'm sure some people will argue against and some people will argue for. I know in Sweden at the moment there's questions as to whether or not the long-term storage that they've chosen, I believe it's copper roofing, as to whether or not that will hold long-term. And there's always scientists on both sides of the aisle who argue each other's points. But the one point I do want to get to is reliability of nuclear power stations. Now, they're always heralded as this ultra reliable source of electricity, but last year, 61%, only 61% of nuclear's electricity had been constantly available because there were unplanned shutdowns or routine maintenance. Is it worth the cost if they're not as reliable as they claim to be?
Are you talking about very old nuclear plants that have been reliably for decades?
I guess that's the argument. Older technology is going to break down, and I guess that's the argument to make.
I think you need a breakdown in that. How many of these? What's the
age of them? And
reasons? What's the availability of fleet-built things that have been going for 10 or 15 years, as opposed to things that are reaching the end of their lifetime? I mean, it's been classically illustrated by the AGRs over here, in that you've now got the fact that they're getting to the end of their lives, they're wearing out. So it gets a bit. There's always going to be a period where it becomes difficult for the regulators to let it go. But certainly, I mean, you can put umpteen examples of light water reactors which have been running in the sort of 90s for decades.
Yeah. I think that is probably the important. It's taken us so long to actually invest in nuclear that people are basing a lot of their judgments on the nuclear power stations of yesterday and not really considering the nuclear power stations of tomorrow.
Yeah. And actually, the industry, because these plants run for such a long time, the industry hasn't had a future focus in the way that the wind and solar industries have, where you've got this kind of dynamism and investment in resources and, new projects and, the future and a focus on the future. Whereas Eric, my colleague, likens the nuclear industry to a bunch of kind of apartment building owners who just just run those buildings. And, it's just, so we kind of need a bit of the dynamism from the wind and solar sector.
Yes. If you look at, I've got one. If you look at the record of the number of reactors which we're building at any one time in the UK, we're talking about maximum of something like 8 or 9 at one stage, and then we go 15 years with nothing, and then all of a sudden, and I mean, okay. We look like we're going to go up to 2 if Sizewell C comes, but will Sizewell C actually happen? Sizewell C has been on the verge of happening for the last 3 or 4 years at least, then is somebody really going to build something at Wilver? And if so, it's just...
Can we deliver? Actually, I was at this nuclear industry conference last week, and, everyone was saying, wow, in light of recent events, the global energy crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, many governments are rethinking their over-dependence on imported gas in their clean energy, so-called clean energy transitions, and looking again at nuclear technology. But, I just don't know whether the industry is ready to meet that demand and actually deliver,
We got a hype.
Or indeed, whether the government has enough consistent vision to do what the government's supposed to do.
I think that's a really key point, isn't it? That we're getting... we're already in a climate emergency, but we're getting closer and closer and closer to absolute crunch time. And there still doesn't seem to be a super coherent... I'm not saying that we need to pick a channel and just go for it right now, but there does need to be a bit more of a coherent thinking around, partly what we're discussing here, the role of nuclear, but also how it's going to fit into a wider whole system. And hopefully that does come forward as soon as possible, because it needs to.
Yeah.
It'll be extremely interesting to see what this great British nuclear thing, which has been involved, whether it actually amounts to anything.
Perfect.
I'm not putting any marks on it, put it that way.
We shall see. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I do really appreciate you all joining us and sharing your expertise.